Hello, everyone. This is Juliette Glassroth. I'm the Director of Communications at Friends of the Global Fight. Welcome to our webinar on private sector engagement with the Global Fund. It seems like we've got a critical mass. I know some folks will still be joining, and that's absolutely fine. Just to let you know about a few housekeeping items today. So at any point during the presentation, if you have a question, you can go ahead and submit it. There's a button at the right side of your screen that says Submit Questions Here. So you can do that at any point in time, and we will try and leave some time at the end of the discussion to take your questions. You can also tweet at the Global Fight if you'd like to tweet us your questions. And please do use the hashtag GlobalFightLive to take part in the conversation. We'd love to see what you have to say. There should be a fairly large group on the phone today, so we do have all the lines muted. So again, if you have questions, just submit them through the chat feature. We won't have the lines open except for the speakers. If you're having difficulty viewing the entire slide, there's a box in the bottom left corner of your screen that says Fit to Screen. So just click that. You should be able to get a better view. And if anything's not working, again, you can chat us, or you can click the blue question mark in the upper left corner of your screen to get things resolved. And with that, I will turn the mic now over to the President of Friends of the Global Fight, Deb Derrick.
Thanks so much, Juliette, and thank you to everyone who's joining us on the phone today. I think we're in for a real treat. We have with us Patrik Silborn, who has been at the Global Fund since 2007. He's worked there in a number of capacities, started out in the external relations working on private sector work before moving into the grants management section of the Global Fund. And during his tenure there in the grants management section, he worked as a senior fund portfolio manager on a really interesting country, Rwanda. And if any of you have seen, there's a special initiative that the Global Fund, under Patrik's guidance, instituted in Rwanda, which was a results-based grant management project, which actually allows greater latitude to the country to determine how to use its money. And then the Global Fund will measure its results based on its results, and then the money will get released in the future on that basis. And so it's a really interesting model, and perhaps we can talk a bit more about it later on. But now Patrik has moved from the fund portfolio manager position for Rwanda into the private sector engagement section of the external relations division. And there he manages a team that works to secure contributions from private corporations, private foundations, and high net worth individuals. He also leads business development efforts and innovating financing models, and works with partners in the private sector to improve program implementation. Again, he's got a lot of experience in grants management and is also working on market-based solutions to resolving bottlenecks and improving service delivery at the country level. So, Patrik, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Your work is critical to the Global Fund and to the world, and we're very interested to hear what you have to say. So why don't we move straight into your remarks. So over to you.
Okay, thanks, Deb. That's quite an introduction. Thank you. I'm really pleased to talk to you today. I will say a few words about our approach to engage in the private sector, why it's important, and how we see this work evolving over the next 2 years. Before I get started, if you're thinking to yourself, what is that accent? I can reveal to you that I'm Swedish. I'm of Swedish origin, just so you don't go on thinking about that during my presentation. Maybe let me start by stating the obvious. The private sector is a very crucial partner to the Global Fund. This has always been the case, but maybe even more so at this point in time. Since the creation of the Global Fund in 2002, there have been significant changes in the global political, social, and economical environment, the landscape. More than 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. There are many more middle-income countries today than there were 15 years ago, and that has, of course, had a positive impact on countries' ability to also generate their own resources to fight the three diseases, HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. And we also see great variation in the impact in the fight against these diseases. Some countries have shown tremendous progress, tremendous impact, while others are lagging. So with these changes, the Global Fund is also evolving as an organization. We place much greater emphasis on a differentiated approach depending on country context to maximize our impact. And I think one good example of that is what Deb just mentioned, the work we do in Rwanda on a completely new model. And we're also supporting countries in other ways beyond the funding. In 2015, 2016, we're looking to launch a new e-marketplace. And this e-marketplace will essentially be like an Amazon.com for procurement of commodities. So it is really a public good that will bring down prices and improve transparencies and efficiencies. But importantly, this e-marketplace will be there even after countries graduate from Global Fund financing. So within this context of these changes, there's also growing recognition that the role of the private sector goes well beyond good governance and resource mobilization. And I would say there's an appetite within the organization and also with our partners to engage in different types of partnerships that are mutually beneficial, engage the core competences of the private sector in a much more pronounced way perhaps, and support countries in their path to sustainable response. And likewise, from the corporate sector, we see great interest in engaging with the Global Fund well beyond philanthropic contributions. So I hope I can give you a taste of that in this presentation. When the Global Fund first started, and there was a recognition of the role of the private sector in all aspects of our operations. But I think it's also fair to say that initially the focus was very much on good governance and resource mobilization. In terms of good governance, the private sector, of course, has a seat on the Global Fund's board. And we have a very active private sector delegation. The private sector is also participating in our country-based governance mechanisms, the so-called country coordinating mechanisms, or CCM for short. The resource mobilization focus is really demonstrated by the RED partnership and the Corporate Champions program. And these initiatives were and remain our flagship partnerships. Together, these two initiatives have raised over $330 million to the Global Fund. So maybe just a few words on these two initiatives. RED was created in 2006 as a fundraising mechanism to engage the private sector to mobilize funds in the fight against HIV in Africa. And RED works with many of the most iconic brands in the world like Apple, Starbucks, and Coke. And these companies essentially create RED branded products, and a portion of the proceeds from product sales go towards the Global Fund. So RED mainly focuses on consumer marketing. The Corporate Champions program, on the other hand, invites companies to contribute significant funds directly to the Global Fund. And Chevron has been our standard bearer and has contributed $55 million to the Global Fund since 2008. These partnerships are tremendously important for the Global Fund, and I think I would say that their impact goes beyond the dollar value. They give comfort to our public donors that they are not alone in providing external financing in the fight against the three diseases. So, they're still extremely important for us. But I think given the changing development landscape and also evolving role of the Global Fund, we are taking steps to involve the private sector in a much broader sense than in the past. Next slide, please. We already have an ecosystem of different partnerships, and these partners have contributed in the fight against the three diseases. But I think importantly, at least from my perspective, they've also allowed us to learn what it takes to involve the private sector in different ways, and the challenges and opportunities that this brings. So in many ways, these partnerships have influenced our strategy going forward. And on the next slide, maybe next slide, please. We'll talk a bit about our renewed strategy going forward. Our renewed engagement strategy is essentially based on three platforms. These three platforms are directly aligned with the Global Fund global strategy and response to our corporate priorities. So with these three platforms, we are aiming to refine both our focus and execution. We're moving away from ad hoc engagements and are focusing on much more strategic partnerships that generate greater resources. To support our country health programs, we aim to leverage the core competences of the private sector in a much more pronounced way, as I said previously. And we often engage the business side of our corporate partners much more than the corporate social responsibility arm of these companies. And importantly, we start by outlining our needs and then request the private sector partners to help meet those needs. In the past, we may have made the mistake of sometimes approaching the private sector and ask, what can you offer us, and then try to retrofit that back into the Global Fund. And that is not the best approach for the Global Fund, for implementing partners, or for our corporate partners. This work that's described, which is about supporting program effectiveness, it will be sorted under the Innovation Hub. And I will say a few words about the Innovation Hub shortly. And finally, the last platform that we have is that we are supporting countries to also generate greater domestic resources in the fight against the three diseases. So in these following slides, I will talk a bit about these three pillars and give some more details. Next slide, please. The financial contributions by the private sector show a fairly strong trajectory, and the private sector pledges have increased by more than 140% since 2010. The major partner is RED, as I just described. RED has contributed more than $275 million. But we have a number of other high-profile and important partnerships, including the partnership with Chevron that I just described, BHP Billiton, Vale, MacAids, and others. And as I mentioned, financial resource mobilization from the corporate sector is still key for us. They give comfort to our public donors, and they can also be key in filling critical gaps that the Global Fund cannot fund, as you will see later on. In 2015 and 2016, we have two major developments that we believe will help our resource mobilization efforts. And the first development is an expected policy shift on private sector earmarking of contributions to the Global Fund. And I will describe this later on because it's a bit complicated. And the second development is the great traction we have in reaching out to high net worth individuals. So these developments taken together makes us believe that we have the opportunity to mobilize an additional $200 million in pledges by 2016. And this would, of course, be a tremendous achievement for the Global Fund. Next slide, please. Maybe you can just press it until the end. Oh, there you go. So what is the unfunded quality demand, and how does this relate to the work we do with the private sector? Well, to explain this, I have to go into some technicalities, so please bear with me. I'll try to make it as simple as possible. Every country has received the Global Fund allocation. So take Rwanda, for example, that I used to work with. They received an allocation of $400 million. This country allocation is what we call the indicative funding amount. And you see that on your left hand, in the slide. In most cases, the funding envelope that we give to countries will not cover all the gaps in the country. So after a country has taken into account domestic funding, Global Fund support, and also support from other bilateral and multilateral partners, there's often a large gap still that remains. So when countries send their concept notes to request for funds from the Global Fund, we encourage them to apply for funds above their country allocation, above the indicative funding. And this is what we usually call the full expression of demand. So once countries have sent their concept notes to the Global Fund, they're reviewed by a technical review panel. This panel is an independent body that reviews country concept notes and also assesses the technical and financial soundness of these proposals. Now, if the technical review panel deems the full country proposal technically sound, the portion that cannot be funded by the Global Fund, that cannot be funded by the country allocation or incentive funding, is placed in a register. And this register is what we call the unfunded quality demand register. So the policy change I just referred to would allow companies to come in and fill the unfunded quality demand in countries of interest, so top up the grant amount that we give to countries. So I really realize that if you're not overtly familiar with the Global Fund, this can all sound pretty complex. So to summarize, let me just say that the policy change would allow private sector partners and high net worth individuals to top up grant amounts for countries where there is a demand and a sound proposal. So we think that this can be very interesting for companies with a particular interest in certain countries, since the contributing partner will really play a key role in achieving greater impact, and this would probably also lead to greater recognition of that contribution to the partner within the country. So hopefully this will generate additional resources from our private sector partners. Next slide, please. Realize I should have a glass of water here. The other major development is our work with high net worth individuals. The wealth of high net worth individuals is estimated to grow to $55.8 trillion by 2015, and this wealth is mainly concentrated in North America and the Asia Pacific region. So this is clearly an area of significant potential and significant interest for us. This work stream on reaching out to high net worth individuals has been developed in close collaboration with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and we currently have 3 active campaigns in Indonesia, Vietnam, and India, and 1 campaign in pipeline for the Arab region. We estimate that these campaigns, based on the great traction we have, may lead to pledges in the order of $120 million, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, by the end of 2016. And we find it really encouraging to see such great interest from high net worth individuals to invest in the development and well-being of their countries, of course, but also to see the Global Fund as a vehicle of choice. And I think this is a testimony to our model and the great partnership that is the Global Fund. The policy change that I just talked about, that will allow earmarking to top-up grants, is particularly important for this work stream. Next slide, please. So, the Innovation Hub. These are still very early days for the Innovation Hub, so what I will present is more the concept and the current thinking. But innovation is really one of the core values of the Global Fund. And the Innovation Hub is an effort to engage a number of actors, public, private, and country partners, to address key challenges across our portfolio. So the Hub is essentially a platform to identify innovations and good practices, test those for their scalability and replicability, and then promote integration of innovations that have potential across our portfolio and beyond. The Innovation Hub will work across 3 broad areas, and these are areas that have been deemed crucial to assure the success of these programs. And the first one is supply chain, procurement supply chain management. The second one is financial risk management, and the third one is program quality. And these different work streams will be led by the Global Fund business units, and an ongoing key task for these business units is really to identify those issues that we need to address collectively to increase our impact. And based on the challenges and core priorities, the Hub will mobilize partners to help resolve these challenges and also find innovative solutions and practices. And in some of these areas, some of the work streams, we have reached a bit further than in others. Next slide, please. The supply chain management work stream will initially focus on 3 priority areas. The first one being inbound logistics, that deals with products that delivered from suppliers to central medical stores at the country level. Outbound logistics, which is essentially products from the central medical stores to health facilities, and also capacity development of in-country personnel. There are a number of other priorities when it comes to supply chain management, but these were selected as initial focus areas because of their importance for an effective country response, and also because of the strong interest of our partners to support this work. More than for other work streams, perhaps, we see that the private sector will really play an important role for this area. Already in May 2014, we had a consultative workshop with over 30 companies, and 20 of those companies, and we're talking about top level companies here, have expressed interest in supporting the development of innovative solutions in the area of supply chain management. By the end of November, just in a few days from now, we will have another workshop where corporations will be challenged to propose and develop solutions for our most pressing needs. And we've already gone through a gap analysis here where we're trying to really outline the core priorities for us as an organization. And this workshop will also have presence by in-country actors from key countries. who can also speak about these issues from a country perspective. So I expect that after this next workshop, we will see alliances formed for the development of products, solutions, and partnerships to support our work. And just to give you a sort of a taste of this, we have already received signals that two companies that normally are competitors would like to team up and develop a stock visibility solutions using mobile technology, building on the product that already exists, but tailoring it to fit with the country needs in high impact countries. Next slide, please.
Okay, and Patrik, is this one for me to take on?
That's you, yes.
All right, so after listening to all the fabulous work that Patrik has been helping to oversee, I just wanted to give a little bit of additional context to the resourcing that he's pulling in, or the additional resources that are likely to come because of these changes at the Global Fund, to add to it a snapshot of what's being done in procurement in another section of the Global Fund, which is additive to what is being talked about here. And that is specifically in Chris Games' section, which deals with procurement on a different sort of level, the procurement processes and how the Global Fund goes about actually making the purchases of commodities. And that accounts for about half of all of the money that flows out of the Global Fund annually. So in addition to the Innovation Hub's work, and in addition to pulling in resources from high net worth individuals and having a different approach to private sector folks, the Global Fund has been making a big effort in its procurement zone to get greater value for money from the resources that it already has. And so when Chris came on, one of the first things that he and the Global Fund did was to start to build their own capacity instead of relying on outside contractors to get a better handle on things like global demand forecasts, which then would allow them to enter into more clear negotiations with the groups that were providing the bed nets or the ART or whatever commodities the Global Fund was looking to purchase. And having a better sense of the market altogether and better having our arms around procurement led to improved negotiations with suppliers, a better production planning for those suppliers and for the Global Fund, better data and more up-to-date and secure data, and then reducing lead times altogether. And just to get a little bit more specific about how this has played out in one key area already, one of the first areas that Chris Games' procurement shop really did focus in on was malaria bednet and bednet procurement. And we've talked about this in a number of ways, but it bears repeating on account of the cost savings that have come from it. When the Global Fund joined forces with DFID and UNICEF and USAID to negotiate better what they were doing and the prices that they were paying for the procurement of bed nets. The Global Fund itself provides or purchases about half of all the world's bed nets. When you add in DFID, UNICEF, and USAID or PMI, then you get to maybe 90% of the world's purchasing power in bed nets. And so by linking arms with those other large procurers, Chris Game and the Global Fund entered into a negotiation which led to a great decrease in the price of the bed nets, 7% on average decrease in the cost of bed nets for the Global Fund. They also expanded the pool of companies from essentially what was a duopoly to, 6 or 7 different companies that were providing bed nets, and also negotiated a reduction in the variation in the types of nets that the manufacturers were providing. And so where there used to be some 127 different kinds of nets, they went down to 12 because you didn't need all that variation. So they reduced the price, they lowered the extraneous variation in the nets, and brought more manufacturers into the procurement thing. And this altogether in this one zone has led in the last year and a half to some $244 million in cost savings. So it's a substantial amount of money, and Chris Game and company are looking to apply some of the same principles. Each market is different, but some of the same principles across the board in all the procurement zones of the Global Fund, and they're projecting that they're anticipating savings of some 7 or 8% per year for the next few years at a minimum. So I just wanted to call that out as additive to the increased resourcing and the other innovative stuff that has been discussed here by Patrik. And now I'll turn it back over to you, Patrik, for the next slide.
Thank you, Deb. So the second work stream of the Innovation Hub is the Financial and Risk Management work stream. We're still working on the strategy for the finance work stream, and we have some strategic questions, and now we're now in the process how to best respond to these through consultations and country visits. So as for next steps, I expect we will see a strategy by the end of 2014, which will lead to concrete actions and also involvement of partners to respond to strategic issues. We do see a strong role of the private sector in this work stream, in particular in terms of financial capacity development and in the development of risk management tools. And in fact, we already have a number of very interesting partnerships that have supported our financial and risk management initiatives in the past, including a partnership with EcoBank, another partnership with SAP, and a third partnership with Munich Re. So in a sense, or in a pretty strong sense, many of these partnerships that we have with the private sector will inform the development of this strategy going forward. Next slide, please. The program quality work stream is the last work stream of the Innovation Hub, and the work and the methodology behind the program quality work stream is slightly different from the two other streams. It is based on the notion that in many countries there's a great variation in impact or in results between different sites. So, for example, you may have one site in Zambia, just take Zambia as an example, that has produced great results in terms of viral load suppression or keeping people on treatment. And then just a few kilometers away, you have another site working in exactly the same health system context that hasn't been, there is nowhere close to the same sort of results. So this indicates that certain sites, certain health facilities have been able to overcome health system challenges by using innovative solutions or strategies. So what we're trying to do with the program quality work stream is really figuring out what are those solutions, what are those strategies that can be used to improve the quality of service at the site level. And the Program Quality Hub is now busy visiting a number of different countries to understand these solutions and strategies, and also try to identify if these can be replicable across the country, but also perhaps beyond and across the portfolio. And we see, a strong role of the private sector here too. Once we know what those solutions are, once we know what those strategies are, will involve different types of partners to really come up with a way of rolling those solutions and strategies out. So this is a key area for the Global Fund as well, and this work stream is actually being supported by Project Management Office, and I hope that we'll see some initial results by early 2015. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll start here on domestic financing. Increased domestic financing is also a top priority for the Global Fund. It's of course essential for sustainability, equitable economic growth, and also highlights the shared responsibility that we have for fighting these three diseases. And I'd say that in many countries the trajectory of increasing government contributions was already in motion before we launched our new funding model. But in other countries, there have been substantial additional government commitments that have been triggered by the policies that we put in place as part of our new funding model, including this counterpart financing policy and the willingness to pay policy. The counterpart financing policy dictates the minimum level the governments need to contribute to the disease programs to access Global Fund financing. So as you can see, it's a policy that differentiates between countries' ability to pay as determined by their income classification. Deb, do you want to say a few words about willingness to pay, perhaps?
Sure. So building on that counterpart financing provision or requirement, the Global Fund is now and newly in the new funding model and in the concept notes or grants that are being negotiated under that new financing model. They are including in every grant a willingness to pay provision. This is a provision that would withhold 15% of any country's allocation and make it contingent on whether or not the country is providing additional money to the pot for fighting AIDS, TB, and malaria. And these commitments are required to be beyond current levels of government spending, over the minimum counterpart threshold, and within strategic areas of the disease programs and related health sectors. So just to explain a bit more, this does not require money to go into the World Bank's account for the Global Fund, but it is expected to be additive to the three diseases and to fighting the three diseases in the country. And this is a very exciting area for the Global Fund because in becoming much more assertive in terms of enforcing the counterpart financing and to providing something of a hard incentive for countries to come to the table. And because of intensive negotiations in a few countries to start with, where the Global Fund will be building it out, what we've seen is a substantial amount of money being pledged or promised to be committed to the Global Fund and to fighting AIDS, to fighting AIDS, TB, and malaria alongside the Global Fund from within the countries, from our partners on the ground, from implementing countries on the ground. As of mid-September, when Mark Dybul was last in Washington, D.C., he was saying that with the number of concept notes that had been negotiated and approved to date, we had more than $500 million in commitments for this counterpart financing or under the willingness to pay provisions. By 2 weeks later at the UN General Assembly, he was saying that that number had already gone up to $853 million. And while we're still working on the calculations because the concept notes are rolling through and getting adopted even as we speak now, we're expecting this to be in the billions of dollars range. So if you're looking at the long-term viability of programs and how do you get additional money to actually end the scourge of AIDS, tuberculosis, or malaria, it's quite evident that this money will need to come from all over the world. And the efforts that Patrik's undertaking and that the Global Fund is trying to incentivize through this willingness to pay provision is one that is likely to result in a very large new stream of resourcing, and something that I think people in the United States would welcome, seeing something that's additive to the great investments that have been put in from American taxpayers. And back to you, Patrik.
Thank you. Thank you, Deb. And I think we all recognize that the public health financing paradigm in developing economies is rapidly shifting. It's moving away from donor fund dependency and towards increased domestic investments. And this shift highlights a real need to not only identify innovative, sustainable new funding sources, but also the necessity to pool these new funding streams in the most effective and efficient way possible. So within this context, we're currently developing a platform that we're trying to roll out that are based on the concept of a health trust fund or a health endowment fund. And we're supporting countries to come up with innovative ways of seeding such trust funds to increase domestic investments even further. So this is really a support to the countries because we have, as Deb mentioned, we have these policies that stipulate that countries need to put in more money, and here's what we're giving back. We're trying to support countries to come up with new ways of finding those resources. We've worked with a number of countries to develop vehicles for increased domestic investment, and this work has been really dictated by the countries. We're very strongly focused on country ownership, of course, and also on the opportunities that we've seen. So in Vietnam and Indonesia, We are exploring the establishment of vehicles to pool resources from high net worth individuals. And some of the proceeds from these resources will go to support the Global Fund, while other parts of the resources will go towards supporting other health priorities in the country as determined by country actors. Now, we also support this work in Kenya and Tanzania, and here the work is really related to domestic resource mobilization. We don't see any of the resources going back to the Global Fund, but and the final vehicles will likely be much more structured. Now, when I say we want to go back to the Global Fund, it will still support significant health priorities in the country, including HIV/AIDS, TB, malaria, and in fact, in Kenya and Tanzania, the establishment of these health funds are very much focused on HIV. The common denominator, though, between these different aspects and different ways of working, is that we hope and expect that these different vehicles will remain in the country long after they graduate from Global Fund financing. Next, please. Next slide, please. So there are many different ways of seeding health trust funds, and one of the ideas we're trying to develop and promote is what we call the health bond. And it's a pretty simple concept, and the health bond essentially leverages sovereign debt. And to give you an example, say country X is planning to issue a bond of $1 billion in 2015 to fund its airport and infrastructure and the various infrastructure projects. Our idea is that a portion of the shares could be assigned to impact investors and philanthropic investors who agree to sweep a portion of the yield into the National Health Endowment Fund. So the investors will still get their principal investment back with the healthy return, but also contribute to the seeding of a National Health Trust Fund. So, for example, the health bond share class investors, instead of receiving a 12% yield, which is, by the way, is a fairly common type of yield in African countries, they would perhaps receive a 6% yield. And the difference between the 12 and the 6 would then be swept into the National Health Endowment Fund. So from a country perspective, they will still receive the full $1 billion for infrastructure development, and would of course need to pay the full original yield. But a bonus is the seeding of this health trust fund. So from our perspective, it seems to be a win-win from all types of different angles. So this is something we're currently exploring. We still don't have any example of a health bond in practice, but we have some significant interest from countries, and hopefully in 2015 we'll have some further traction on this. Next slide, please.
Okay, and this is just to get a bit more granular with the trust fund ideas or some of the work that, again, is going on that Patrik mentioned in Kenya, Tanzania, and Nigeria. And Kenya has been one country that has been highlighted and has been very forward-leaning in terms of stepping up to the plate to provide and ensure increased domestic resourcing for fighting HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria. And when the Global Fund went down to enter into the first round of negotiations with them, we presented the government with the idea of doing more in the domestic financing zone, and then went away and came back. And by the time the negotiators went back to Kenya, the government and President Kenyatta in particular had been leading an effort that actually came up with a very concrete 4 streams of work towards increasing domestic financing. And some of this was discussed up at the UN General Assembly when President Kenyatta was on the dais and made the public statement that every African country can and should find their own ways, small and great, to invest more in health. And one of the 4 streams that is under construction or discussion in Kenya is creating an AIDS and non-communicable diseases trust fund. The idea behind it would be that it would get a certain percent, 1% of the government resources altogether, and the projections are that it could cover up to like 74% of the HIV and AIDS financing gap for the next few years. This trust fund is now under consideration by Parliament in Kenya. So again, this is really exciting work, and it's moving along smartly. We're very grateful to Patrik Silborn and the rest of his team at the Global Fund for the work that's underway. And I think at this point we'll turn the floor open to questions. And we've gotten a few in, and please feel free to submit more. But Patrik, one of the viewers is interested in knowing when the next workshop is going to be, and a bit more about the details of the one that I guess is going to be toward the end of November on building private sector solutions. And then that same person is interested in knowing how they can participate.
Okay, the workshop will happen on the 24th and 25th of November. I know that there's the Thanksgiving weekend or Thanksgiving in the U.S. It's very unfortunate, but those were the only dates that were open, unfortunately. But if the viewer could potentially send me his or her contact details, I'll be more than happy to provide all the logistical details and the venue and the objective behind the workshop.
Okay, we'll be sure to get that information. If they'll submit it to us, then we'll get their contact information to you. Another listener is writing and asking about Kenya. Kenya being touted as a trust fund success story. What characteristics of this country have allowed that initiative or this initiative to take off?
Well, so Deb, I mean, you can probably answer this as well, but from my perspective, it's really about political leadership. Has been one of the key components for the trust fund in Nigeria to take off. Also, the strong involvement of partners and civil society in advocating for a trust fund in Kenya, and also providing some of the technical support necessary for the startup phase. Those have been some of the key components for Kenya.
Yeah, and just to build on that a bit, not just in Kenya, but in other countries such as South Africa, we have seen what a critical difference it makes when the leadership of the country really takes this on as their own and makes it a priority. So we are greatly indebted to President Kenyatta for his forward-leaning activities on this. Another viewer, or not viewer, but another person in the audience is asking, how are you going to measure the impact and synergies of public-private partnerships?
No, that's a really good question. I think that we as development partners have not always been great at measuring or even monitoring the impact from these partnerships. We are taking steps within the Global Fund to ensure that every partnership that we launch, every initiative that we launch, have clear metrics and have clear success metrics, both from all different angles, from the partners, from the country's perspective, and from the Global Fund perspective. So we'll have a much more results-based approach going forward, similar to the results-based approach that we have for our grant recipients, where we have a performance framework of such, and that's what we're trying to do also with the partnerships going forward.
Okay, and another question. We're just going to keep firing them at you. How have the domestic private sector companies participated in the country coordinating mechanisms? Have the domestic companies been participating in other ways, or have they been recipients of grants funds?
Yeah, so I'd say that in many cases, in many countries, there've been participation by the domestic private sector. It really depends on the country. I think we probably have around 130, 140 different CCMs, given that we have country grants in 140 countries. But what I've seen during my tenure as a fund portfolio manager is basically a mix of different approaches. In some countries, you have a business association that represents a number of different companies, and sort of represents that constituency, and the business association is on the CCM. In other cases, you have a particular company. There may be an international, maybe a national company that represents that constituency. And of course, it's the responsibility of that representative to also communicate the actions in the CCM to its broader constituency. But it's really a mix. You see different approaches depending on the country. In Ghana, for example, Ghana has been led for a long time by the private sector. The private sector representative on the CCM has been the chair of the CCM. And now I can't recall if it's a Ghanaian company or if it's an international company. But I know that that's been very successful and has provided much more sort of business thinking and business acumen in the CCM's deliberations.
Okay, and one more question. What, aside from social responsibility, what is the incentive that you're seeing for the private sector to work with or share their processes with the Global Fund?
Well, that's a really good. Thank you. That's a really good question again. And I think this work we're doing with the Innovation Hub sort of straddles corporate social responsibility and future business opportunities. I'll try to explain that. What we're asking companies to do under the Innovation Hub with support to sort of support the program effectiveness is to come up with products, solutions, partnerships that would improve our effectiveness as an organization and improve country health systems. Now, what we're asking these companies to do is to commit to develop these products, commit to these solutions, and also commit to sort of the pilot phase. But if these products and solutions are viable and really provide the sort of results we're looking for, and of course we'll measure these results, then this can potentially turn into a business opportunity, because these solutions could then be marketed to different to countries and to different actors. So, take the example of a stock monitoring solution, for example, that we test out in a few countries, and if this is something that is useful, that can actually help strengthening country systems, there's nothing telling that this couldn't turn into an opportunity for the private sector. So what we're trying to appeal to here is not only the corporate social responsibility side, but also appeal to the business opportunities that may arise. And we mostly work in developing markets. If you look at Africa today, yes, it's true that they have an extreme disease burden, and we need to address it. But at the same time, it's also one of the sort of fastest growing markets. And I think many forward-looking companies recognize this and would like to get a foothold.
And going back to this is taking prerogative of my seat in running this show. I'm very interested in your prior work in Rwanda. So just to take it a little bit back to the work that you did there and results-based financing. Can you give a little snapshot of how that's evolved? And I mean, it struck me as terrifically exciting. Were you as enthusiastic about it as you were putting it in place, and how do you think it's going?
Yeah, yeah, I'm very enthusiastic about the results-based financing model in Rwanda, and it's not directly related to the private sector, of course, but I can give you the background on how it came about. And I'd say, just to give you some context to start off with, Rwanda is a country that has been extremely successful in applying for funds from the Global Fund and also from other partners, including PEPFAR and PMI. So it is a country that has received a lot of funds compared to sort of the population size, but they've been able to use those funds to great effect. It's one of the success cases when it comes to global public health, I would say. But long term, or like medium to long term, we see that the Global Fund allocation to Rwanda will likely decline. It will likely go down. And we see the same thing from bilateral partners, where they try to sort of shift some resources away from Rwanda towards other high burden regions. So this is an issue. So how do we maintain the great results that Rwanda, the great impact Rwanda has been able to achieve, but with less funding? So the great bargain that we did with Rwanda was to say, together with the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Health, we came to the conclusion that Rwanda could do with a bit less of resources, but it needed more flexibility. It needed more flexibility in using these resources to be able to achieve the same impact. So this results-based finance model essentially is based on a few principles. The first principle is that we will continue measuring outcomes and impacts. So instead of measuring, the inputs and the outputs, we'll only measure what really matters, the outcomes. How does the money really affect people's lives? How many people? What is the coverage of treatment, for example, in Rwanda? What is the coverage of outreach to key affected populations, and so on. The second, the second principle is that we make disbursement decisions that are directly linked to the results of these outcomes and impacts. So I have to contrast this a bit with the way we normally deal with global fund grants, and that is that we take into account the outputs that have been produced by the grant recipients, and then we take into account the cash balance that they have, how much money they spent, the budget going forward, and so on. And we're moving away from that in Rwanda. We're saying the only thing that matters for us is the results. And if you achieve the results, we'll disperse the money to you. The other big change is that we rely much more on national systems. So we rely on the Minister of Finance receiving the money. We rely on the Office of the Inspector General in Rwanda to conduct the external financial audit, and we rely on country systems we rely exclusively on country systems, I would say. This doesn't mean that we are reducing all the oversight. I have to stress that. Because of the importance of results to us, we actually have a much more comprehensive approach to measuring those results compared to other grants. And we also retain the possibility for us to also do our own specific procurement audits, for example, in Rwanda, and to do other service to ensure the quality of service is still there. And I guess the last principle is that we give much more flexibility in the use of the funds. So if Rwanda, sometimes a country that is able, that is capable, that has strong systems, sometimes countries see that there is a need to redirect resources to achieve greater impact, and we allow Rwanda to do so to much greater extent. Now, this model will only work for countries that have very robust and solid country systems, I would say, and where there's a strong leadership, and where there's a lot of capacity. And we tested these systems. We had our own Office of the Inspector General going to Rwanda to spend 6 weeks with 11 staff members to test almost all aspects of the system, and they came back with a very clean audit saying that the systems are strong, they are robust, and we can go with this model. So this is a model that's very particular, I would say. There's not many countries that are in pipeline for this type of approach, but I think it can almost become something to strive for, an aspiration for other countries. It can be seen almost as a goal for other countries, and I think that's how our leadership here in the organization also would like to sort of couch it or to present it.
Yeah, and I think that's especially noteworthy given that the U.S. government and Ambassador Debbie Birx is talking about trying to get more data. So if you get better data, better systems all together, then there presumably would be more countries that would be able to grab hold of this and get some greater autonomy for bigger results. I think it's a very exciting development. This will be our last question, and then we'll release you, Patrik. But going back to your public-private partnerships, you mentioned, I think, that you were looking at results-based measurements for these partnerships, and I was wondering if you could give any any examples of the kinds of indicators that you might be thinking about.
So this is still work in progress, and it's a bit more difficult than for grant agreements that we have. Normally in grant agreements, I hope this is not too technical, by the way, but for normal grant agreements, we normally measure national results. So we don't measure grant-specific results, but we measure national results. Now, these partnerships that we're launching usually have are aligned, of course, with those national results and are intended to have a positive impact. But normally the scope will be less broad than a full grant. so. That is pretty obvious. If you have a grant that is, $200 million to run the partnership itself will probably not be worth $200 million. So what we need to come up with are indicators that measure the contribution by the private sector partners and how those are linked to the programmatic results that we're looking for. So most likely we will have a selection of process-related indicators. For example, if you have a partnership focusing on capacity development, that could be anything from the people trained and the outcome of that training based on a survey, based on a test, to indicators that are more linked to the programmatic results. But that is still a bit of work in progress, and what we try to come up with is essentially a number of standard indicators that we can use across partnerships that are similar in nature, to also be able to identify what partnerships that work better than others, and and also of course the rationale for why those partnerships are working better than other similar partnerships. So, and to be able to do so, we need to come up with those measurements that are sort of shared between different but similar partnerships.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Patrik. That was an extremely helpful presentation. I know there are other questions, but I want to be sensitive to everyone's time because we're hitting the hour right now. For any questions that we didn't get to, we'll look at different ways to follow up with you and continue the discussion. Thank you again, Patrik Silborn, for taking the time to be with us today, and thanks to everyone on the phone for joining us, even on a semi-holiday here in the United States. If you're looking to learn more, please be sure to visit www.theglobalfight.org. The slides from this presentation will be posted on that site in the Get Involved section. So please take a look and join us. In the meantime, thank you again for being part of this webinar, and have a great